Hello, humans and the environment. Welcome to our course. I am out here in Durham a few days after a massive storm took down this tree that you can see behind me onto a house. This is about a block away from my house. I thought this would make an ideal location to introduce the course because this is absolutely a sign of the relationship between humans and the environment. Climate change is increasing the severity of severe weather, so as I hope you all know already. But this is a great place to start the course because this was an incredible storm. It happened in 20 minutes. We were just sitting on the porch watching the storm come in, and then all of a sudden there was a need to take shelter inside. We closed the doors and watched this just amazing event unfold over the next 20 minutes, which left trees down everywhere, the power out for 24 hours at our house. People were still without power 2 days later. The traffic lights were all out. It was just like utter mayhem. And it kind of, reminded me of the fine line that we walk with the kind of infrastructure we have and take for granted, and how soon that can be destroyed, and how a few blocks away, people were fine, didn't even realize what had happened in my neighborhood, at least. So I just wanted to introduce the class that way, talking about that storm, because it was an incredible event. It was incredible to watch, and here's some of the evidence of that storm. But now I'm going to talk about the syllabus briefly. So I started the syllabus out with a short introduction to the course. This is the syllabus as it stands. It may change a little bit before you see it. But here's how the class works. Basically, each week you'll be assigned some materials to either read or watch. It might be a video or a podcast to listen to. And almost always there will be a quiz to accompany the material that week to make sure you are keeping up with the reading and assess your understanding of the material. The quiz will be available from 8 a.m. on Thursday until 5 p.m. on Sunday. So there is also a blog for this course, so you will be creating a blog. Make sure you take a look at your classmates' blogs. The first blog assignment is to introduce yourself, so I encourage you to go through, see who else is taking the class as people submit their blog posts. There are also summaries of each week on Moodle, which you can read more about that week's readings, a sort of synopsis of each week, what's expected and what's been assigned. The blog entries are all outlined in detail in the syllabus, so I encourage you to read them all at the start of the semester. You'll be baking bread one week and doing a variety of other tasks and assignments, which I think you'll enjoy. Many of the blog posts require that you meet with a group and that you do your work with a group. Every group member has to be present for those assignments to receive credit. And part of the reason I do that is because the group work is the main way that I have to make sure everyone in the class is doing all right, to make sure people are accountable for the work. And I want to know if somebody's not able to complete their work or being unresponsive, so that I can seek further help for them and check in with them myself. So it's really important that you are in touch with all of your group mates well in advance of the group work assignment due dates, and that you reach out to me if anyone in your group is missing or unaccounted for or unresponsive. Let us know that as soon as possible. There's also a final exam and an essay due for this course. We'll start out by reading Ishmael, which I think you'll enjoy. There are crews working here right now on the lawn and yard work, and probably this tree removal eventually. I think those are the main things I have to tell you. So if there are any questions that come up throughout the semester, as always, please be in touch. So I talked about the blog, the quizzes, there's a final exam at the end of the semester, which will follow the same format as the quizzes. You can see all the due dates. Oh, the blog posts are also due Sundays at 5 p.m. Sundays at 5 p.m. is a main time for this class. If you don't like that due date, you can submit your work anytime before that. So if you want to free up your weekend, I highly recommend completing the assignments by Fridays so that you have a free weekend and don't have to be doing this work on the weekend. But Sunday at 5 p.m. is the last time for the blog post and the quizzes to be submitted. You can see here there's a movie that we'll be watching, which is available on YouTube. We're going to do a bunch of fun stuff, a bunch of interesting new types of things that you probably have not encountered before. And hello. I hope you enjoy the class. So take a look at this tree again, and hopefully you made it through that storm okay. That I will be talking about Ishmael some. So I hope you enjoy reading this book, and I hope to hear from you all as questions arise, and I will see you later. Today we're going to be talking about this book, Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. I've chosen this book to sort of set the feeling for the entire class. There are a few things to note before we get started. One is that this lecture and this book and the class as a whole should really be thought of as a spiral staircase, something like that, in which we will be circling around and around, building on what has come before as we make our way up this spiral staircase. So today we'll be looking at themes from this text, but these themes will be reappearing throughout the course of the semester in the different things that we read, and the course will sort of fold back in on itself as we think about some of the themes that show up in this textbook as they appear in the readings and research that we're going to encounter throughout the semester. And then we will circle around back again as we think about Indigenous philosophy towards the end of the semester, and we read Braiding Sweetgrass and other Indigenous perspectives that really bring us back around to some of the themes we will first encounter by reading Ishmael. So we'll be reading this book over the first 3 weeks of the class, and I know that I will leave some stuff out in this lecture. I'm just going to try to touch on some of the most important ideas that come up in the book, but there are a few other written documents to help you understand this text and incorporate the material into the rest of the class. One of them is a set of chapter summaries that I've posted on Moodle with the readings for this week. So I have divided the book into thirds to read it over the first 3 weeks of the class. And for each third of the book, I've posted a summary of some of the main ideas and concepts from that third of the textbook. And I've also included a Grand Master Study Guide for Ishmael, which was actually created by a previous class in which I was an assignment for those students that we worked on together as a class, creating this sort of master document that highlights a lot of the main themes and ideas from Ishmael and explains sort of what's going on in the text. And so that is a much more thorough guide to this text than this lecture, but I will be giving the lecture focused on the central themes that appear in Ishmael, and the lecture itself will correspond to that document, the Master Study Guide. So that's a good way to follow along and to have something you can read to go back and get more thorough information about some of the ideas I'm just going to introduce here. Another thing to note about this book, if you haven't noticed already, is that the way I'm thinking of it, there are 13 chapters altogether. So that's why by the time we get to the end of chapter 13, you should have finished the book. So each chapter has several parts. So you can see my copy looks like this. And you start out, first page is chapter 1. And then on the next page, there's a little one, and I consider that a section of the chapter. So so just to make sure we're on the same page, no pun intended, about what is assigned for each week, and to make sure you're not thinking that the little sections are actually full chapters, because those are just sections of the chapter. And so make sure that the way you're counting, there are 13 chapters overall. And another thing to note is that we might not all have the same edition of this book, which is no problem, but it just means that the page numbers might not be the same between you and the other members of your group, or between you and me. So I try not to use page numbers when I'm referring to different parts of the text. Instead, I'll use the chapter number and the section number. Okay, so this book really is going to shape the rest of the course. And we're going to look at 9 different themes that show up in this book in this week's lecture. And some of these themes you will have encountered already. Some of the ideas that I'll talk about you will encounter during next week's reading as you finish the book. But these are the themes. And like I said, we should think of this as a spiral staircase. So these are not all separate themes, separate from one another. All of these themes are connected, and some of the ideas are hard to characterize, hard to classify as part of, one theme or another theme. They're all kind of mixed together in certain ways. But this is the best I could do to sort of pull things apart so that we can have an intelligent discussion about different sections of the text. So to begin with, mythology and enacting a story. So this is a central idea that appears in this text again and again, and it may be Ishmael's main goal or Quinn's main goal to help us acknowledge the myths that we tell ourselves and the way that we in our culture are enacting a story. So I've chosen a quote to go with each of these themes, and the quote I've chosen here from chapter 3, section 1 is, "No creation story is a myth to the people who tell it, it's just the story." So the idea is that when you are actively believing in these mythologies, in different myths, you don't even notice that they're myths because you believe them so fervently. So we have this story that we don't even notice, and the author sort of works his way, the narrator, sort of works his way through figuring this out as he's talking to Ishmael, that our creation story that we don't really even pay attention to is that, a long time ago there was slimy stuff in the oceans, and it made copies of itself and became more advanced and developed, etc. And then there were, lizards crawling out of the ocean, and then there were mammals, and then there was stuff in the sky eventually, and beings just became more and more complex until finally humans appeared on the earth, right? And that was sort of the culminating process, the culminating invention or creation that all of the other stuff was leading up to. So here we are, humans. The whole point of the existence of everything else is us. And this is what Ishmael thinks is part of our creation myth. It's just a myth. And to show why it's a myth, he says, consider if the jellyfish had a similar story. And they said, first there were slimy things in the ocean, and then they became more and more complex, and then finally jellyfish appeared. Well, we know that's not the end of the story, because life kept evolving and we got to us, and here we are. And it's silly to think that jellyfish would think that they're the end of the story. But analogously, Ishmael thinks it's just as silly for us to think that we're the end of the story, because there's no reason to think that everything culminated in us. We're just another point on the timeline, right? And if we shift our mythology, we could see ourselves as playing a role somewhere in the middle of evolution, with more life to come beyond us, and it not really being all about us. Okay, so that's part of our myth. The idea of enacting a story is that we're acting so as to make the story true. Okay, so that's what it is to enact a story. And a culture is just people enacting a story. So a lot of our mythology, the ideas come to us through what Ishmael calls mother culture, this sort of whispering in our ears that's constant. It's almost imperceptible, the way that the hum of a fridge is imperceptible, which we know is ambient noise, right? Ambient noise is just noise that's humming in the background. It's so ongoing and subtle that you don't even notice it because it's been ever present. Okay, so you may not notice your fridge humming in the background until it shuts off, and then suddenly you're like, whoa, I just heard, now I hear silence for the first time, but I didn't even realize that I was listening to that sound, right? So Ishmael thinks that mother culture whispering these stories into our ears is kind of like the hum of a refrigerator, providing this ambient noise that we have to really open our eyes to notice. It has to be pointed out to us. The same way that locals don't notice the same kinds of things that tourists notice in their surroundings. So we are enacting this story that human beings are the whole point of evolution, the end point, the culminating spot in this story. We're enacting that story, which means acting so as to make it true, in the sense that we're going to bring about the end of the whole thing, right? We're we're undermining the planet's capacity to sustain human life, and that's going to result in the end of us. So we will be the end of that story, in a sense, if we keep enacting the story the way that we are. Okay, so that's all part of our culture. And then there's other aspects of this mythology, like a lot of detail around the story of Adam and Eve and eating from the tree of knowledge. And Ishmael thinks that we tell ourselves that, Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, and then she had the truth, and then was forever condemned to toil and work to sustain her life. And Ishmael thinks that we actually have that story all wrong. That actually what happened when we ate from the tree of knowledge is that we came to think we had the truth. We came to believe that we could rule the world like gods without actually having that truth and without actually having that knowledge. And so that was why the fruit of the tree of knowledge was forbidden, was because it gave us a false sense, a false kind of arrogance that we would know how to rule the world when we actually didn't have that knowledge. Okay, so we thought we would take the world out of the hands of the gods and rule the world ourselves as humankind, but actually we were just fooling ourselves, because what the fruit of the tree did was just make us believe that we understood how to do that without us really understanding how to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about those ideas when we get to the takers and leavers. Okay, the next idea is the world was made for man. So this is a huge part of our mythology. So here we have this iconic image of the earth at night, which is going to come up again in the class. But here it is. You can see how man has just taken over the world, right? This is all of our highways and city lights and houses glowing at night with the light that we have created, all this sustained by fossil fuels. And the quote I've chosen here is, if the world was made for us, then it belongs to us and we can do what we damn well please with it. So this idea that the world was made for us, that we are the point of creation, is sort of a premise in our reasoning. It's a reason for believing this conclusion that because it was made for us, we can do whatever we want. We can just basically annihilate everything else, kill everything else, and take over the world and use it to serve our interests. And this is from chapter 3, section 6. Okay, so the world was made for man isn't a belief that all of humanity has had. And we can contrast this with this next idea that actually man was made for the world, that man belongs to the world. So for this idea, I've chosen this quote. The lever story is, the gods made man for the world the same way they made salmon and sparrows and rabbits for the world. So we're going to talk more about levers and takers, which you have already been introduced to in the text. But this is an alternative way to think about our relationship to the world, that we belong to the world, that we are part of the world. It's not as if we're separate and all of this is for our benefit. Instead, we are a part of these natural processes, and we are subject to the laws of the world, the natural laws of the world, just like salmon and sparrows and rabbits are subject to those laws. Another big part of this text is that we are not fundamentally flawed. So Ishmael spends a long time getting the narrator to identify this belief that we have, that we tell ourselves that we are fundamentally flawed. We think, oh, we're bound to screw this up because, we're so egotistical and we're so, selfish and lacking in forethought and unable to really see the bigger picture. And so we're just going to have, this tragedy of the commons idea, this idea that we are bound to just mess everything up. And Ishmael is critical of this idea. He thinks this is, again, part of our mythology, part of what Mother Culture is telling us. Mother Culture is telling us that we don't know how to live, that we'll never know how to live, and that because of that, we're just fundamentally screwed up. And we were destined to make the world a paradise, but we're screwing it up again and again because that's just our nature, to screw it up, right? To put our self-interest over sustainably living in peace with the rest of the world. And Ishmael's evidence that this is not true, this is not the correct picture. Okay, so again, our mythology is telling us that we're just completely fundamentally flawed. But Ishmael is saying man is not fundamentally flawed, and the evidence for that is that man has lived on the earth harmlessly for millions of years. But then we come, the takers, and mess it all up within a few relatively 500 generations, the last few thousand years, 10,000 years. And so we think that this is because we're fundamentally flawed, but that ignores that we had millions of years of living in peaceful, sustainable coexistence with everything around us. So Ishmael's point is that it's not us. The problem is not with our human nature, because humans have been fine until the takers arrived on the scene. The problem instead is with our mythology, with our culture, with mother culture. We need a different story to enact, according to Ishmael. Okay, so we have these cultural ideas just sort of humming in the background. We don't even notice them. They tell us that we're the point of creation, that the whole world exists for us, and yet, and they tell us that there's no hope. We're bound to mess it up. But Ishmael's saying that's not the way it is. There is hope, because we don't need to change our nature. We don't need humans to go away. We just need to change our culture, to change the stories that we tell ourselves and how we relate to the earth and how we think of ourselves in relation to the earth. Okay, so it's not that there's something fundamentally wrong with us. And the evidence for that is that we have lived peacefully in harmony with the world for millions of years. Another theme that shows up in this text is the idea of captivity. And so pay attention, in those first few chapters, Ishmael is describing his own captivity and some of the questions that arise for him when he's plucked from the wild. His mother is killed and he's taken from the wild and put in a cage, right? He says that in the wild he could just eat from the trees. The fruit was just around. He could just, everything that he was doing was meaningful. He was, fully invested in just living and eating and being part of a family in the wild. But here he's placed in a cage and he's fed, tasteless food at specified intervals. And for the first time, as a result of being in captivity, he starts to question, like, why am I doing this? Why am I even here? Like, what is the point? And so you can think about how that relates to our own captivity, because Ishmael believes that humanity is captive to the world. And we're captives. Here's the quote I've chosen. You're captives of a civilizational system that more or less compels you to go on destroying the world in order to live. From chapter 1. So he's saying, we are, in the same way that he had this rich, meaningful life in the wild and then was plucked from the wild and put in a cage and now is like questioning the whole point of existence, you can consider ourselves like that, because we're part of this system, this structure, and we're destroying the world. We're about to devour ourselves, in Ishmael's language. We're going to bring the whole thing to the point of collapse, and we don't even want to be doing this. And at the same time, our lives are just kind of like depressed, and we have these issues that people living closer to nature never had, like suicide and depression and addiction. And Ishmael thinks that all of these problems that we have are a result, in part, of us being stuck in this system, going to work every day and just doing it so you can eat and make it to the next day and not have to worry about the future. And then you can have some kids to do the same thing that we're doing, right? Just working all the time and being tired when we're not working and being really far removed from our food sources and the effects of our lifestyle on the air we breathe, and all these kinds of things are why we have these, things like addiction and depression and people just doing harmful things to each other and not being fully satisfied with our lives, worrying about the future all the time and what we're going to eat and whether we'll have a roof over our heads. These things are non-issues in the wild, according to Ishmael. Okay, so that's the way that we can think about Ishmael's captivity relating to our own, is that he's, for the first time, starts to wonder, like, what's the point? If you find yourself asking, what's the point of all this? What am I even doing this for? Right? Ishmael thinks that's not even a question that would arise if we were living closer to nature. Other things to note about captivity is that we are captives of this system, captives of the world, because we're about to destroy ourselves, even though we don't want to be destroying ourselves. And part of the reason we're stuck in this cage of captivity is that we can't see that it's a cage even. We can't even recognize that we're stuck. We can't even see that we're in captivity until Ishmael comes along to point it out to us. And the bars of that cage are what we've been talking about, mother culture, these myths that we believe about ourselves and believe about our destiny on earth and our purpose here. Okay? At the same time that we are captives of the world, we've also made the world our captive by controlling every aspect of nature, basically, and destroying all the other species. Okay, so three things about captivity. One is the relationship between Ishmael's captivity and our captivity. The second is that we are captives of the world in a sense. And the third is that the world is also our captive. Okay, so all those ideas built into this theme of captivity. Okay, another big part of this text is the law of all life, or what's also called the peacekeeping law. So Ishmael says that's one expression of the law. Here's another. The world was not made for any one species. Okay, he puts this law a few different ways. Like, you're allowed to compete with other species. So competition is a natural part of life. It's a natural part of how animals interact with one another. But he says you're not allowed to wage war on the rest of life, on the rest of creation. And the way we're waging war is, like I've said, just exterminating other species. So arguably we are in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. We're going to talk about that and our effects on other species. We're eliminating dozens of species a day, which works out to like tens of thousands of species each year. And it's a dire situation when you consider our relationship to other species. And that is the way that Ishmael thinks we are violating this peacekeeping law. What's important about this theme also is that we see ourselves as exempt from the law. We think that we don't have to follow this law, right? We don't have to follow the law that the world was not made just for us. We don't have to follow this idea that you can compete with other species but not wage war with other species. We think we're exempt. We're not like the rest of nature, right? We live in these cool air-conditioned houses, right? And we have cars and technology, and nature is like out there. It's not. We could reasonably just ignore it, right? We could even not walk on unpaved earth if we wanted to. Probably most of us. You can walk out the door to your car and get in your car and drive to a parking lot and come in a nice big air-conditioned building without ever having to walk on the actual earth, on actual unpaved earth. So we think that we're separate and different, but part of Ishmael's point is that this is the law for all of life, and we are subject to it just like anyone else. And another part of this idea of this law of all life, Ishmael compares us to one of the earliest pilots learning to fly, an airman creating these flying contraptions and jumping off of cliffs in their new flying contraptions, and doing this before they understood the law of aerodynamics, right? Before they really understood about lift and gravity and how airplanes work. We were just creating these contraptions and then jumping off a cliff. And you can imagine somebody who's doing this, creating this flying machine, a machine that they think will fly, and jumping off a really, really high cliff and thinking as they're plummeting to the ground that they're actually flying. But Ishmael thinks we're in free fall, right? That in this example, the pilot is in free fall because he just jumped off a cliff in this machine without understanding the laws of aerodynamics. And he thinks we're the same. Because we haven't understood this law and understood that we are subject to this law, we're just building civilization after civilization and everything keeps crashing. And that's because we don't think We don't really understand this law or think that it applies to us. And so even though we think everything's great, right? Because the world is better than it's ever been. We have cars and television and internet, and I can, ask any question on my phone and get a pretty good answer, right? Who could have thought that that would be possible just 100 years ago? Well, Ishmael thinks that's like being in free fall, thinking you're flying, because actually what we're starting to notice now is that the ground is approaching. We see that we are not exempt from this law, that if we wage war on the rest of humankind, we will ultimately destroy ourselves. And so maybe these kind of problems that we're witnessing, like climate change, the heat in the West, and the fires that are currently happening right now that are affecting the air quality in North Carolina, right? Those are examples of ways that we may begin to recognize that we can't do this forever. This is not this is not a good strategy long-term, right? We need to figure out how to build a sustainable society, or else we're going to be like the airman in free fall and eventually crash and burn. Okay, which brings us to our next idea, destroying the world. So I've chosen the quote: "No one specifically wants to destroy the world, and yet you do destroy it. Each of you contributes daily to the destruction of the world." And this is also from chapter 6. So Ishmael thinks we are stuck in this cycle. We couldn't even escape it if we wanted to. That's the problem. Part of the problem is that once you read Ishmael and you're aware of these problems, and you're aware of the mythology and the problems with mother culture, and the fact that we are about to crash and burn, right? Even if you recognize these things and you want to save the world, there's this problem of like being caught up in a cultural stampede, in that you have to participate in destroying the world, or else you don't get fed, right? You have to get a job, and you have to, drive a car to get to where you need to go, and you have to participate in this system that's ultimately going to lead to our own destruction, or else you don't get to eat. Okay, so you can't really just leave it all behind, because the way the culture is driving this further and further into the ground. So like the airman, which is why I've chosen this photo, we can't just jump out of the aircraft at this point. So we have to think more strategically and better about how we're going to shift our culture, right? It's not about, recycling or getting an electric car or something. It's not about individual choices. It's about a collective shift in how we think about humanity and our connection to the world. And because I think it's even more important, the idea of saving the world is even more important in Ishmael than destroying the world, I have also chosen this image and theme. And I think it's important to emphasize that the whole reason that Ishmael put the ad in the paper in the first place, right? And the ad that we start out this book with: "Teacher seeks pupil, must have an earnest desire to save the world, apply in person," right? This is right in the first chapter, in the first section. This is Ishmael's point, is that we have to begin to wake up before it's too late, right? That if we don't wake up, then we're going to crash and burn. But we still have a chance. There's still a possibility that we could turn things around. And that's how we save the world, again, is that we change our culture. We have to change the story that we've been telling ourselves. And so I think Ishmael clearly believes it's possible to save the world, or else he wouldn't be looking for a student who wants to save the world. Okay, and I've put here a picture of young people in a town called Love Canal who were poisoned by living on top of a toxic landfill, and we're going to talk more about that soon. But Ishmael thinks the way to save the world is to educate our other people around us and help people understand what the problem is, and join forces together to start to enact changes. And he tells the narrator, you have to go tell at least a handful of people what I've told you, and have them each tell a handful of people, and then we can have exponential change the way we have exponential population growth, which we're also going to talk about. Okay, so I think one of the secrets to changing the world is thinking about exponential growth and how exponential growth curves work, because we can also use those to our advantage to create changes that multiply exponentially. And finally, that brings us to this idea of the takers and leavers. So here's the quote: "The takers are those who know good and evil, and the leavers are those who live in the hands of the gods." Okay, so the leavers are the world's indigenous people who have, we might call them primitive or uncivilized, people who are still living within their cultural traditions, in harmony with the world and not destroying the world, living closer to nature, and who have been here for millions of years living in those ways. There are still a few of them scattered around, and we think they're, undeveloped. Whereas okay, I hope I said that right, that those are the leavers, to denote the idea that they leave stuff where they found it. They take only what they need, and they appreciate what they have, and they don't take more than they need. The takers, on the other hand, that's us, so-called, civilized culture. The major cities of the world, those of us with tall buildings around and air conditioning in our houses, and we can eat, those of us who can eat food from any season, any time of the year, and who get our meat from grocery stores. That's us, the takers. And the idea that the leavers live in the hands of the gods is also from the biblical interpretation that Ishmael is giving. So the leavers, just sort of accept that they belong to the world, and they accept when there's abundance of food, and when there's less food, their population decreases, and that's how they maintain this balance. They see themselves as part of that system. They live in the hands of the gods, in the sense that the gods decide when it's who should live and who shall die, right? And the takers, that's us. We are those who came to believe that we know good and evil, that we know how to run the world, and we know who should live and who should die, and basically we think we should live and everything else should die so that we can live, except the stuff that we need to live, like the stuff we eat directly, without thinking about other things like insects and fungi and all the stuff that just gets on our nerves or just gets in the way, from this naive perspective. So we believed that we knew who should live and who should die, and we took things into our own hands. But like I've said, this belief is a false belief. We don't actually know good and evil. We don't actually know how to rule the world. And so we have to come back to living in the hands of the gods, right? And I would just want to show this timeline, if I can find it quickly. Which I clearly, here it is. Okay, so here's the timeline, right? We have the leavers here since 3 million BCE, and until now, still there are small communities of leavers spread throughout the world, if we haven't murdered them yet. And the takers are this recent offshoot, here about 10,000 years ago with the invention of agriculture. And so just, a new way to think about history, and who's really, normal, and who's the sort of unnatural part of this story. Well, we see ourselves as kind of living the way you should live, and those other cultures as being primitive and uncivilized and all that, which we've talked about. But really, if we look at the whole of human history, it's the other cultures that have been around the longest and that already know how to live, right? They've already succeeded in living in balance with the world and living in a way that could continue indefinitely, whereas we have created this catastrophe that's having catastrophic consequences as we speak, that we are becoming more and more aware of. So one more thing about the takers and the leavers is that leavers have this sense of history, a sense of, cultural transmission through the ages, through generations, that they come to know, they come to have knowledge of how to live through living close to nature and being connected to their history, which has developed over generations through millions and millions of years. Whereas takers believe that, the beginning of agriculture was the beginning of mankind, right? We think of ourselves as the whole of human history. And so Ishmael accuses us of having this kind of cultural amnesia where we don't remember where we came from. We don't remember the past. We think that, that we've never known more than we know right now, and that the past is brutal and nature is, tooth and claw. Like if we were part of nature, we'd just like be getting mauled by lions or something, and that there's nothing useful for us in the past. But that's just, again, part of our mother culture telling us that, and actually part of the way that leavers have achieved this kind of balance that allows them to live sustainably is by valuing the past and valuing the knowledge of their ancestors and the traditions that have been passed down through time. So I'm sure I've missed a bunch of stuff from this text, and that's why I've included the written summaries and the written study guide, which you should definitely use to help you as you work through this textbook. I hope you are enjoying this book. I usually have good conversations around this book, and I hope you will have good conversations with your group around the book. I've tried to incorporate those conversations because I really don't think this lecture is the best way to understand this material. I think the best way to explore this material and comprehend it is to incorporate it into conversations with your family and people you live with and your group members from this class as we do certain exercises related to this material for your blogs. And then you're going to be writing a paper about Ishmael, connecting Ishmael to the rest of the class. And so I just want to encourage you to be thinking about the rest of the class as we move on from here after we read Ishmael, to be thinking about that material through the lens of Ishmael, and to be thinking about all these themes as you read more about humans and the environment, and to be thinking about what Ishmael would have to say about some of these ideas. Because I'll tell you, once I started to do that as I was preparing this class, some of the stuff we're going to read sounds like Ishmael wrote it himself. So there are all kinds of areas where you can find a link between this book, Ishmael, and the rest of the material that you're going to encounter as part of this class. And again, it's like a spiral staircase. Okay, so we're going to come back to these themes again and again, especially as we read Braiding Sweetgrass towards the end of the semester, which is a story really written by an indigenous person who is also a scientist who studies botany. So these themes are going to fold back around on themselves, and you should encounter the material that we're going to be discussing with the mindset of having just read Ishmael and thinking about how these themes relate to the rest of the class, and looking for ideas that you might want to connect in your paper, especially. So I hope I've helped, and I would love to hear from you about Ishmael. So please feel free to email me or meet with me during office hours. This is probably the part of having this course be online that I most wish I could talk to you all in person about, because I love this book and I love reading it with students. So I would love to hear what you think of it, and I hope you will enjoy discussing it with your group mates. Have a great week, and I will see you next week.